Hey guys, today I just want to do a quick intro on migration. Migration is the second half of Unit 2, and so we're going to be talking today about humans on the move. Alright, so what is migration? Migration is essentially permanent movement. So it is only considered migration if the person is intending to stay in a location for the long term or a permanent amount of time. So there are some other types of movement as well. One of the types of movement is called cyclic movement. Cyclic movement is where we do this type of movement every day. We move through what is called our activity space. All right, so when we are doing some sort of cyclic movement, it's the type of movement that you're going to leave your home every morning and you know without question that you will be returning to your home that evening. So if something is a cycle, it is something that you repeat over and over again. So for it to be cyclic movement, it would have to be repeated day after day. So an example would be your movement throughout the building on A days. So on A days, you move generally in the same pattern from first period to second period to third period or lunch, and then up to fourth period, and maybe to practice, and then to home. And you take the same basic path every single day through your activity space. Now, the next type of movement is like cyclic movement, but it's called periodic movement. Periodic movement is you leave your home and you plan on returning home like in cyclic movement, except for you're going to be gone for an undetermined time period. So you're not necessarily going to be coming home every single night like in cyclic movement. So we're talking about where you would have an extended time period where you might be gone, but you're not planning on it being permanent. So it might be something like vacation, or maybe some sort of military service where you deploy for 9 or 10 months, but you know you're planning to come home when you're finished. Or sometimes guest workers do that when they are performing types of migrant labor. All right, so this slide is actually pretty cool. This is showing major migration flows. And so if you look at this map, what you can see is that our major migration flows have us moving from, and when I say us, I mean humans, moving from less developed countries, or LEDCs, to more developed countries, or MEDCs. Obviously, we can understand why people would want to move from less developed countries to more developed countries for an overall better standard of living. So when we talk about migration, there are essentially two major types. You have forced migration and voluntary migration. With forced migration, it's something where you don't have a choice, all right? Generally, you are fleeing from some sort of really dangerous situation. It's usually going to be something like there's a war, or you are being persecuted maybe for your faith, or there's been some sort of natural disaster. And this is going to cause a situation where you are leaving in an involuntary manner. And so you have to go because you fear for your life. So the second type is voluntary. And this is obviously going to be a type of migration where people weigh the pros and cons, and after weighing the pros and cons, they say, hey, you know, I think I would be better off if I moved to this other location. And when you move to that other location, you are making that choice. No one made you do it. You're not necessarily in any sort of significant danger, but there are some things that are pulling you to that location because you're able to improve your overall standard of living. So let's talk real quick about some examples of forced migration, though. Probably the largest example of forced migration in the history of humanity, of course, was the Atlantic slave trade, where Europeans were bringing African slaves, they were capturing African slaves and bringing them to the Western Hemisphere. Estimates vary on how many people were brought from Africa to the Western Hemisphere, but we know it was in the tens of millions. If you look here at this map, you can look at the flow out of sub-Saharan Africa. As you can see, the heavier or the bigger the arrow, the more people or the higher the volume of slaves who were brought. So if you look, you can see that a significant amount went to Brazil, the French Caribbean, and the British Caribbean. And then the Dutch Caribbean, Spanish America, and British North America had a little bit smaller volume. But this is probably one of the largest examples of forced migration in the history of humanity. So next are some other examples of some forced migration. You may have studied some of these. I'm sure the majority of you last year studied the Native Americans removal, where the 5 civilized tribes were relocated from east of the Appalachians to places like Indian Territory, which is modern-day Oklahoma. Of course, many of you have studied how the Jews were forced out of various parts of Europe during the Holocaust. In India and Pakistan, we see that people who are Muslim are forced out of India, and people who are Hindu are forced out of Pakistan. So those are some other examples of forced migration, historical examples. Some modern day examples of forced migration. Of course, today in the news we are constantly hearing about Syria, and there are refugees who are fleeing Syria in mass right now. They're going to various parts of Western Europe, Eastern Europe, and all over the Middle East. They fear for their life. They're forced to move. Hong Kong in East Asia has been expelling Vietnamese immigrants who've come there to work. And then, of course, in the last few years, the United States has been sending Haitian refugees who came after the 2010 earthquake in Haiti as refugees back to Haiti because that country was getting back on its feet and making some improvements. Now, voluntary migration, when we think about voluntary migration, there's a couple of things we have to consider. What makes people decide to move is probably one of the biggest ones. And so we really need to consider that question. So first thing I want to talk about is the laws of migration. British demographer Ernst Ravenstein, he proposed several what we call laws of migration, and the 5 that we studied for AP Human Geography are listed here. The first is every flow generates a return or counterflow. That means that for every 100 people who immigrate and choose to move to a place, there will be a few who decide to go back home. That's called counter migration. The second law is most migrants are likely to move a short distance. And that's because, guys, think about it. We would rather make short moves. It keeps us close to the area that we're most familiar to. And, of course, it's cheaper to make short moves. The third one is that migrants who make long distance moves tend to choose big city destinations. And we have to ask ourselves, why? Well, of course, the reason is because big cities are going to offer more services. There's going to be more jobs, housing, more opportunities for people moving there. The fourth one is that urban residents are less migratory than rural residents. So people who live in cities are less likely to migrate than people who live in the country. And so urban residents are not going to be as migratory because they have more jobs and services offered in their current location. And then last but not least on the laws of migration, families are going to be less likely to make international moves. Remember, international means they're going to move from one country to another. And so single people are going to be much more likely to do that, because you can only imagine it would be super hard to move an entire family, and you have to consider about the language barriers for your children, how they would fit in and make friends, and so families aren't as likely to make international moves. This is just a really cool infographic that kind of shows who is immigrating to the United States. Take a second and look over those. It'll show you where our major migration flows are coming from. The next thing I want to talk about real quick is the gravity model. The gravity model predicts essentially who is going to be moving, and it has to do with the basis of population size and distance between the two places. So it's predicting whether or not people are going to be likely to move to a location from a second location. So I want to show you a couple of images that will help you with that. Now, you guys have seen this before. We've used it as time-distance decay, but we can also use it when we talk about the gravity model. Again, go back to what we've already learned, and remember that as distance increases, all right, the likelihood of interaction here is going to decrease. And so we know that we will be much less likely to move to a place as we get farther away from it. That makes sense. Remember, Ravenstein said we're more likely to make what type of moves? Short moves. This is another image that kind of helps us understand. If you look, again, the heavier the line is, the more likely people are to move to a location. So notice the thin line here. People are less likely to move from the yellow location to the blue one. Why? Because it's small. This blue area here would not offer as many goods and services as, say, the green one. So look how heavy the line is with people moving to, all right, the green area. Why? Because big cities, remember, are going to offer more goods and services. So this has to do with push and pull factors, and this is the last thing we're going to talk about in this quick recorded lecture. All right. So push and pull factors are essentially the reasons people either choose to move to an area or choose to leave an area. So push factors are going to be conditions or perceptions that help a migrant decide to leave. Those are generally going to be negative things. If you look at the graphic, you can see that it has things like unemployment are going to push us out. Low wages, crop failure, which would keep us from having enough food, poor living conditions like lacking infrastructure, poor health care, education services, natural disasters, war, dangerous conditions. So then think about it. Pull factors are going to be completely the opposite. Pull factors are going to be things that are going to attract a migrant to a location. All right? Pull factors are going to be drawing us in. So they're going to be things like having a large number of jobs available. Not only a large number of jobs, but remember, jobs that are high paying, because we all enjoy money, right? Okay. Also, better living conditions, good infrastructure, nice schools, hospitals, safe environment, places where we feel protected, and of course, less chance of natural disasters. I will tell you this. Push factors are usually far more accurately perceived than pull factors. Pull factors are usually things that we've seen on TV, heard from, word of mouth from a friend, and so they're not always necessarily true. Sometimes we get to a new place and we don't see all of those pull factors there. So here's a couple of your types of push and pull factors. We're talking about economic conditions, things like can we find jobs and what kind of financial conditions are going on in an area. Of course, political circumstances. Do we have a fair system of government? Are people allowed to vote? Next, of course, conflict. No one wants to be involved in an area where there's war going on. Environmental conditions. Maybe there's dangerous smog. Cultural traditions of some sort that might, be things that we don't enjoy. And then last but not least, technological advances. Those can definitely draw us into an area. Okay, guys, so this is all we have for today. If you would, please go back to Google Classroom and watch this video about push and pull factors. Thank you.